Welcome everyone. We are very happy to have you with us on the session of legal and regulatory issues on 3D printing. Um, as we go, I would request you to put any questions you have in the chat box. Don't wait for session to end because we may not be able to take your questions. Depending on number of questions, we will try to answer them as much as we can. If we can't answer all the questions, we'll be happy to take that offline. With that, let us start our session. Uh, the topic what we have chosen today, 3D printing, is very interesting topic because while it is 30-year-old technology, it has picking up in last few years, and it will actually, as we go forward, fast forward few years, I believe it will even play a more important role. And because of the potential of the industry, of the technology in few particular industry, we thought that it is important to examine on how this is likely to grow and what are the legal and tax issues which may end up if this industry grows the way it has potential to grow. So let's little bit of introduction just to get everybody on same page. Um, 3D printing is basically printing using additive style at this point in time, while adding different materials to create a particular object. And the object which is created is based on a CAD file. The CAD file is a file which has been created just like a programming file, which has all the information which is given to the printer for printing that particular object. The CAD file is actually created using special softwares and 3D scanning technology to come with that particular intellectual property or technology which allows print 3D printer to print out that particular object. Currently, if you look at it, it is used in precision making tools. It is used where it is not easy to transport that particular item. On a long-term basis, it has a huge potential to decentralize manufacturing process, make supply chain redundant in certain industries. It has implication across wide varieties of industries, but in particular, as of today, there is a significant implications in industries like pharmaceutical, life science, building materials, defense industries, and so on. There are few issues which comes up because of this technology, and some of them are, for example, intellectual property. Then there will be trade issues, whether it's an import-export issues. Also, there would be issues with respect to product liability. And a lot of questions may come up based on how do we actually put this 3D printing, where instead of product being shipped across, what is being shipped across is a CAD file. And instead of manufacturing happening at the source, it is happening at a destination. So this creates its own legal and tax issues, which we will address during our session. With this basic information, and before I go, also we have just written a paper which we will be releasing soon on 3D printing and legal issues in 3D printing. So whoever is interested can go to our website as and when it is ready, or write to us. We'll be happy to send it to you. With this, let me first go to Darren. Darren, can you spend a few minutes and tell me what are different business models which may come up for 3D printing?
Yeah, thanks, Vaibhav. So broadly, there are two models that we see or anticipate, and of course, we're also seeing a lot of these business models in place today. But them into the commercialization of the CAD file itself, and the other is where you operate the 3D printing technology as a service. So when it comes to commercialization of the CAD file, It can either be in the form of sale of the CAD file in its entirety or by way of license. Now, when it comes to the sale, we're looking at a one-time purchase by the buyer, and this is usually seen in the services industry, where a customer would require something customized to meet the particular requirement of the customer itself. So you find that the service provider will design the CAD file specifically for the requirements of the customer, and then sell that entirely to the end user. In such a situation, the use of the CAD file can be eternal, to the extent that it can be used multiple times. It can be modified further. The customer has full rights as to how exactly that CAD file can be then printed onwards or sold onwards as well. The other form is in terms of licensing of the CAD file, and this is more in terms of where you would find that you could restrict the number of times that a particular product can be printed out, or the period in which you can use that particular CAD file itself. For example, if tomorrow Nike, and of course Nike today has already started printing out soles for its products using 3D printing technology. But for example, if the entire shoe wanted to be printed at home by a customer, the Nike would be able to just license the CAD file for the particular period of just having to print that one, the time frame for just printing that one shoe itself, or the one pair of shoes. And accordingly, then after that, the CAD file would expire at the customer's end. So this is on the commercialization of the CAD file itself. On the other end, we find that 3D printing can also be turned into something as 3D printing as a service. And this is where you can draw a parallel with today's photocopy shops, where if you don't have access to a 3D printing machine, or you don't have access to the kind of 3D printing machine that you require to get the kind of goods that you require for the time being, then you could approach a 3D printing service provider who will only print out the particular item that's required from your end. So the CAD file will have to be provided by the customer, while the printing itself will be taken care of by one of these service providers. So broadly, Vaibhav, this is some of the models that we're seeing in terms of the 3D print technology today.
Thank you, Darren. I just discussed that intellectual property is a key aspect in 3D printing, because instead of sending product, the person is sending intellectual property. Jaideep, can you tell? Can you give an overview of the IP issues in 3D printing?
Sure. Thanks, Vaibhav, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll divide the discussion into the branches of IP which we see, which would be copyright, patent, trademark, and designs. And each of them present their own issues. They're all very interesting because it's a new type of implementation of a technology. Starting with copyright, it's likely that the CAD files would be protected as artistic works under copyright law, because the definition of an artistic work includes drawing. And CAD files are represented graphically. To the extent they're represented by software code, they may also be protected as literary works under copyright law, the same way as other software code is protected. And to that extent, anyone creating a reproduction of a CAD file, which was the copyright of someone else, is liable for infringement. Regarding the product itself, the question arises as to whether it can be protected under copyright. When I say product, I mean the 3D printed object as opposed to the CAD file. And copyright law again recognizes things like sculptures, engravings, and other works of artistic craftsmanship within the definition of artistic work. So to the extent that an argument can be made that something is a sculpture, and it'll be interesting to see how courts or authorities interpret that, or it's a work of artistic craftsmanship, the 3D printed object may also qualify for copyright protection. Regarding trademark, just to take off from the Nike example that Darren was making, The question arises as to whether if I am creating a CAD file which may infringe on somebody's trademark, say I have created a CAD file of a Nike shoe with the Nike tick on it, whether I am liable for infringement if I have not taken proper permission from Nike. So it's not immediately clear because I may or may not have used that trademark in the course of trade. Um, it may be only the printer. It may be me if I've sold it with the tick on it. There's also potentially a theory one could make under common law of contributory infringement, but to an extent it'll depend on whether the infringing mark is denoted on the CAD file. Of course, if somebody prints an object infringing on somebody's trademark in the course of trade, that may make them susceptible to prosecution for trademark infringement or passing off as well. The third branch, which is patent, raises an interesting question of whether the CAD file of an innovative product or process would really amount to a patent. And it seems a little unlikely because patents are given for inventions, which are defined to mean products or processes. And whether a CAD file is a product seems like it's not. Uh, Whether it's a process, maybe if a stretched argument is made that because the CAD file leads to the product, it's a process. That's one line that could be taken, but it really seems like it's a blueprint of an invention rather than an invention itself. The second branch of analysis is um, on infringement detection. So if I'm a patent holder, as Vaibhav was saying and Darren was saying, it makes it easy to transport um, an object. So if there's potentially someone infringing an object, they can ship it and distribute it pretty much under the radar online. And that makes it quite hard to detect infringement because the end users may have the 3D printer and are printing out the objects in the privacy of their own facility. To that extent, just coming to the theme which we might pick up later, this seems analogous to something like ebooks or online music, where we may need to start seeing digital rights management models and encoded protections on the files themselves and processes for intermediaries to guard against piracy. The fourth aspect is on designs. So designs protect and the aesthetic part of an industrial design. So a drawing or design and the various types of industrial designs defined is protected in its aesthetic sense, but it does not include artistic works or merely functional products, or what they call mere mechanical devices. So to the extent something's an artistic work or is purely functional, it may not be protected as designs. The other question is whether one would want to apply for design protection at all, because the term of protection is 10 plus 5 years, 10 years originally and 5 years with an extension. So whether that makes sense in light of how one wants to commercialize it is a question that comes up. So I'll pause here and we can pick up some of these themes as we go along.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaideep. Just on one point, while CAD file, as Jaideep mentioned, by itself may not be patentable, though it's an arguable process, as Jaideep mentioned. The underlying technology on the manufacturing side. So, for example, if you have created a unique product, right, which you can actually print out, right, that product itself can be independently patentable, right? Whether you convert into CAD file or not, it's a different point. So, underlying technology can be protected. With this, let me also clarify. I just got a information that the book is the paper what we have written on 3D printing is actually on our website, so you can actually go and download it. It's a recently written. We'll just add it up on our website. So feel free if you are interested in it. When looking at how things are likely to work out, right? Just now we see how recipes are put online, or some of the other things are put online, we feel that there will be a social media site or some website on which a lot of people will start putting their CAD files, and if somebody is interested to print, and if they have access to 3D printer either at home or outside, they will download that CAD file, print it, and it may be on revenue share basis, it may be on freely given. We'll see how things evolve. But what is likely is that there will be a website where people will be able to go and download all the files, which a third party will put it up, for people to download. Then the question really comes is, would how the liability will come on that particular website. We know if something goes wrong, then maybe liability to the person who developed the CAD file. There may be liability on some other people, but what will liability on the website, right, which is actually helping or facilitating the download of CAD files? I will go to Shreya. And Shreya, if you can just kind of take this question of mine, and then spend a few minutes on it.
Thank you, Nishith. So essentially, what intermediary liability deals with is the liability that relates to the person who does not deal with the electronic record themselves, but actually deals with them on behalf of another person. So, for instance, this person receives, stores or transmits that record, or provides a service in respect of that record. So, for instance, maybe this person is a website hosting service where people can just upload their CAD files and users can generally just download them. So, or it's a search engine that lets you search CAD files across the. So these are the types of services that are characterized as intermediary services in India, which basically means that they don't deal with these files themselves, but just let users upload files onto their website. So how does the Information Technology Act 2000, which generally governs the transfer of electronic information, regulate the liability of intermediaries with respect to CAD files? So the law here is really similar on 3D printing or on CAD files as it is generally also. And the law basically says this. So there's the section 79 of the IT Act, and that provision is colloquially known as the safe harbor provision. What it essentially says is that if you are a person who has and you're an intermediary, as we discussed earlier, like a website hosting service or a search engine, and you haven't initiated the transmission, you haven't selected the receiver of the transmission, and you haven't selected or modified the content or the information contained in the transmission, then you should not be held liable for any infringement, any IP infringement, with respect to the content that was hosted by a third party on your website. So that's the first 3 bits of criteria. And the next bit of criteria is the requirements that are specified under the Intermediaries Guidelines 2011. Which say things like, if you're a website that provides hosting services, you have to have a privacy policy in place, you have to have a terms of use in place, and this terms of use has to state that it's forbidden or prohibited for people to put in infringing stuff on the website. So if these criteria are followed, then the website itself, which is the intermediary, would not be held liable under the Information Technology Act. But the situation is a little different if the website does have control over the content that is posted on the website. So maybe in situations where a website vets the content that is put on the website before it is uploaded, then then maybe they're taking responsibility to ensure that this content does not infringe the intellectual property of any other person. So in those limited set of cases, the intermediary can be held liable. Another situation where an intermediary can be held liable is if they did not take adequate precautions as prescribed under the law. So maybe if they modified the transmission at any given point of time, or they select the receiver of that transmission, then in those situations, they would be considered to have violated the Information Technology Act. And so they can also be held liable for the IP infringement in addition to the person who is just uploading the IP. So that's a general overview of intermediary liability under the IT Act. Over to you.
Thank you, Shreya. Now let us come to tax. we can have a whole session on tax, looking at tax issues in 3D printing, because this whole changes, the whole business model is changed, right? As I was saying earlier, instead of sending a product, the sender actually or seller actually sends a file. Instead of manufacturing at the source, the manufacturing happens at the destination. This can be cross-border, or this can be in different industries. So there will be a lot of implications on tax side, both from direct tax and indirect tax perspective. And while I don't think we can do justice to tax in our session, and originally we did not plan to talk about tax, but this was so important that we specially invited Afan to join us, just to give an overview of tax issues. A brief overview. I know, Afan, you can speak for an hour, but you just have a few minutes to touch upon these issues.
Yeah, like VP very rightly pointed out that there are a host of things that we can talk about in terms of the tax implications. But I think what I'll do is I'll give a broad overview of certain direct or indirect tax implications that may become really relevant. So, from a direct tax perspective, the one thing that may become an issue, and this is something that may become an issue generally in a cross-border scenario, is that in the business model where there is sale of the CAD file, and the CAD file is being sold by a non-resident to a resident in India, then how would that income be taxed? Would become a question of how that income would really be characterized, and the question of characterization of that income. So the yeah, so as I was saying, one is the characterization issue that may crop up with respect to 3D with CAD files is akin to the issue that may that is already there in respect of the distinction between whether it is a sale of a copyright or a copyrighted article. So to put it simply, when there is a sale of a CAD file, it would depend on whether it is sale of the copyright copyright contained in it with the right to exploit the underlying IP, or would it be sale of the entire CAD file itself? So if it is sale of the CAD file itself as an article or as a good, then the income that would arise from it would be characterized as business income, and there would generally be no taxes in India unless the non-resident which is selling the CAD file has a permanent establishment in India. And however, if the sale of the CAD file can be characterized as sale of the underlying copyright in it, in that case, the income which is paid to the non-resident may be taxed as royalty, for which the tax rate in India or the withholding rate in India is 10%. Uh, Coming to licensing of the CAD file would be pretty straightforward, wherein the income which would be paid for the license of the CAD file would be characterized as royalty and would be subject to a 10% withholding tax in India on any payments that would be made to the non-resident. So that was broadly on the, the business model of sale and licensing. On the business model of 3D printing as a service. Now, when 3D printing as a service is being provided, again in a cross-border scenario, there may be tax implications in India if the payment for that service would be characterized as fees for technical services. Now, specifically in the context of 3D printing, uh, it is unlikely. I mean, it would depend on whether it is characterized on FTS or not, because as per the Supreme Court's judgment on FTS, one of the prime elements for payments to be characterized as FTS is that the service which is being provided should have a human element, which is why when a 3D printing is being provided as service, it would have to be evaluated whether it is a standard product which is being provided, or whether there is any human element which is involved in the provision of the 3D printing service. So as Darren mentioned when he was explaining the business model, that there is a, I mean, in most cases the 3D printing service would be provided in such a manner that it will be customized for each consumer. So given that customization would involve a human element, there is a likelihood that payments which are going to be made for FTS which are going to be made for 3D printing as a services to be characterized as FTS and hence be taxed in India. So that was broadly on the two models on whether it could be characterized as royalty or FTS. Another issue, direct tax issue that could also crop up is if, let's say, a non-resident entity which is providing either CAT file as a service or a good, or whether it is even providing, 3D printed goods by way of export and by way of import into India. So that may also result in certain tax implications, provided that the non-resident constitutes a permanent establishment in India. A permanent establishment is a concept where a non-resident becomes taxable in India by way of having some business presence in India. In the context of 3D printing, a non-resident may end up having a permanent establishment in India in a few scenarios, such as, let's say, if the non-resident has a 3D printing facility in India, or if it has a storage facility for the equipment that is required for the 3D printing, leading to formation of a fixed place permanent establishment. A permanent establishment could also be constituted in certain other scenarios, such as, let's say, the non-resident provides 3D printing services through their agents in India, or by way of, let's say, sending their own employees or personnel to India for making the sales or providing the services in India. So these are the issues that may, I mean, few areas which may result in the formation of a permanent establishment of a non-resident in India. And if a non-resident ends up having a permanent establishment in India, then any income that it would derive from India by way of whether it is sale of the CAD file or by sale of the 3D printed product may result in having tax implications. That was broadly on the direct tax side. On the indirect tax front, uh, now we all know that GST is applicable essentially on supply of goods or services. So similarly, even in the 3D printing industry, any event of supply of good or service would be subject to GST. Now, if the supply of good or service is in the same state, then it would be subject to just normal CGST and SGST. But if it is interstate, then it would be subject to IGST, where the center would be collecting it. I think one important point to note here, as Vaibhav mentioned, is that unlike the traditional models, where the supply chain would be really long, resulting in GST being imposed at each level of that supply chain, that eventually resulted in a huge tax burden in the hands of the consumer, because ultimately indirect taxes and GST is the ultimate burden of it is borne by the consumer. So with the 3D printing model, where the supply chain is likely to be reduced, and where the manufacturing is going to come closer to the consumer, and when the supply chain is going to be cut in that sense, the GST that is going to be the total GST impact on the consumer is also likely to reduce. And the last aspect on this is basically the when there is going to be import of a CAD file or a 3D printed product. In case of import of a CAD file, again it would depend on whether it is characterized as a good or a service. But import of goods, but regardless of whether it's imported as a good or a service, it would be subject to GST, and the rates would of course depend upon its characterization and the and the entries in the rate schedules that the government may come up at that point in time. However, one important point that should be noted in respect of import of 3D printed goods, whether in the form of CAD files or whether even in the form of the actual goods which are printed, is that in addition to IGST, which will be levied on import, the existing customs duty will also be levied, because when GST came in to replace all the indirect taxes, customs duty was not replaced. The only change that happened was that earlier, in addition to customs duty, you also had, in addition to basic customs duty, you also had countervailing duty and special additional duty. to basically offset the effect of excise duty or sales tax in India. But now with GST into place, instead of a basic customs duty plus countervailing duty and special additional duty, now how it will work is that in case of import of the good, the levy of GST would be IGST in addition with the basic customs. So that was broadly a summary on the tax implications that may crop up in the 3D printing.
Thank you, Afan. While we will take questions later for everyone, I thought there are two questions on tax specifically brought in right now. Maybe you can just handle it. First question was, you talked about a Supreme Court decision regarding referring to FTS. Can you share what was that Supreme Court case? And the second question is on equalization levy. It says, is there a doubt that equalization levy will not apply? Can you just spend like a minute if you can immediately, and if you can't, then maybe you can take that offline.
No, that's fine. I can share the judgment, but it was a 2015 judgment by the Supreme Court, where the aspect that they had gone into was, when we are talking about the payment that is being made for a service which is being provided, whether or not it can constitute fees for technical services. Then one of the questions that came up was whether any payment made for services would constitute FTS if the service which is being provided is completely automated and there is no human element involved. And the reason this question came up is because when we look at the definition of fees for technical services, it involves fees being paid for three kinds of services, which is managerial, consultancy, and technical. And when the court was expounding, or the court was analyzing the import of the word technical, it said that the term technical, since it is clubbed with other words such as managerial and consultancy, it has to be it has to be given a consistent interpretation with the words that are around it. And with that kind of an interpretation, the court held that since for consultancy and managerial services you require a human element, then even for the technical services that we are talking about, for the scope of FTS, human element would be required. So that was broadly the aspect of the Supreme Court judgment on human element. As far as equalization levy is concerned, it's a good point, because recently, earlier equalization levy was only introduced in respect of online advertisements, but Finance Act 2020 in fact expanded the scope of equalization levy, which is of course being criticized by the entire community, to include any kinds of services which are being provided by a non-resident over an online platform. So I think, and in fact, it's vast enough to even cover situations where it is being provided to another where the service recipient is also not Indian, but the target or the consumers are based in India. So I think the question of equalization levy would depend again on a lot of factors, and whether or not the service that is being provided through the service which is being provided in the form of providing the CAD file would be considered as a service which is being provided online or on a digital facility.
Thank you, Afan. So I think the summary here is that this is a subject matter of a whole new session, and there is a lot of structuring which will go into it once 3D printing business or the business model starts exploding. With that, let's move on to other areas. We till now have just focused on the CAD files, right? And people sending CAD files instead of sending products and stuff like that. But there's also another important element in 3D printing, which is the ink, the raw material which is used for producing a particular object, right? Because unlike normal printing where the inks are very standard, right? Here, the ink or raw material which is used for printing actually will depend on a particular industry, right? So for example, for pharmaceutical, it will be different. It will be drugs. If you look at food industry, it will be different. For defense industry, it will be different. So, each industry will have a different ink. You will have a specialized 3D printer where you can only use for particular industry. For example, Lee Cronin has actually come up with a 3D printer called Computer. And maybe I don't know if Darren is likely to talk about it. But, you have those special printers coming up for a specific industry, or sometimes that can be a general purpose printer where, lot many inks, it can take different kinds of ink, just like how you have how you store your things in refrigerator, right? Different things you store, you can store different inks and then get the object printed. So things will evolve around it, but what we will do is we will take specific few industries. Specifically, we want to take pharmaceutical, life sciences. We'll also touch upon food industry and defense industry, where we are actually seeing use of 3D printing as an important aspect. Now, that's where I think it will develop and go further. So these are the industry which we are going to see. Let me first go with the food industry. Darren, this is a question to you. The food industry can potentially adopt 3D printing on a huge scale, right? What are some of the instances in which 3D printing can be used in food industry, and what are the issues which can arise, right? Just imagine a situation where you have a 3D printer, and instead of ordering from a hotel, can you send me a burger? You actually ask a hotel or a chef, right, Sanjeev Kapoor, saying that, hey, can you send me AutoCAD file of 3D printer on my 3D printer, and I have raw materials which you suggested. I will just put in my 3D printer, and then, hey, I have a particular dish given by Sanjeev Kapoor, right? So you have those kind of situations. If you have that kind of situation, what are the issues, Darren, which you look at, which you see can happen?
Sure. Thanks, Vaibhav. So I think primarily, yes, 3D printing in the food industry will be disruptive, especially in the example that Vaibhav. But we also have to remember that for most businesses, taste is also a very important factor, which means that the ink may or may not be wanted to be provided directly by the business itself. For example, consider there are 50 shades of chocolate, and if a company like Lindt were to get that trademark taste right at the consumer level, they may want to be the ones who supply the ink as well. So that being the case, there are still a couple of fun applications that we can find in terms of 3D printing in the food industry. For example, there are already companies that are in the market that are producing fruits that look like one particular fruit but taste like another. There are companies even in India that are producing chocolate in different types of shapes and designs. But apart from these kind of applications, there's also a very significant and application to the extent that it can also be used for the purpose of customized nutrition. And this is also, it borders on the healthcare and nutritional side of things, where basically, especially for patients who are unable to digest or unable to take in too much nutrients in one go, the food products can be customized to infuse more nutrients into it. The macro and the micronutrients can be added on to the regular food products, and then accordingly, based on the particular individual needs of a patient or a person who has difficulties in consuming, these can be put into the food product and accordingly can be supplied to the person. So from a legal perspective, we have to remember that now in terms of food law, all of food law has been consolidated, and the regulator involved is the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, and the FSSAI has come out with comprehensive rules, regulations, and the primary legislation that deals with food in all aspects. So in terms of legal principles, we have to remember that food regulation, one is, of course, is highly regulated. The other is that the broad principles are safety and hygiene. These two things have to be kept in mind when it comes to any food business operator that operates in the space. So whether food would actually be considered, whether 3D printed food would be considered food within the current legislation, yes, because the law and the definition for food as it is given today is broad enough to even cover the kind of food that 3D printing would account for. But one thing to keep in mind is that while it is considered a food, what it also will be considered to be is possibly a novel food. So there is a distinction in the food law whereby there are standard food products and then there are novel food products. So, food products for which there is no history of consumption in the country. Now, standard food products are those that have a lot of history of consumption. The standards have been prescribed by the authority. So, for example, for hard-boiled candy, there is standards for how much sugar needs to go in, how much of the additives can go in, so on and so forth. And these ranges are based on what data is available in terms of safety. When it comes to novel food, there are two categories. One is where there is no history of consumption, and the other is where it has been manufactured by way of a novel method. And 3D printing could fall under both categories today, which means that in all likelihood, at least in the initial phase, all of the 3D printed food should fall within the novel food category, which is slightly more regulated in terms of the food law today. So when it comes to novel food, one, you may be required to take an approval from the regulator. Is that in order to obtain this approval, you will need to provide safety and efficacy data and scientific evidence to show that your food product is safe and okay for consumption. So when it comes to novel food in the 3D printing scenario, we have to remember that the ink will be the ingredient and the manufacturer will be the 3D printer itself. So in a situation where we would possibly have to go to the regulator to get a product approval in this situation, it has to be in tandem with both the ink manufacturer as well as the 3D printing manufacturer, because the two of them are linked for the purposes of manufacturing the food product itself. So this is one in terms of how it would be regulated. The other is in terms of liability. So there are already stringent measures in place to prevent the adulteration of food products and to prevent non-standard food products from getting into the. Now, the question that comes up is that in terms of who can be attributed in terms of liability when it comes to a 3D printed food product. Will it be the manufacturer of the ink? Will it be the manufacturer of the food product? Will it be the person who supplies the CAD file? Or will it be the user itself for whatever reason there was a contamination at the consumer level in terms of at the time of printing the product itself? So as of right now, that clarity is not available within the law. And but in most instances, we do see that the manufacturer is the one who is held responsible. But because that in this situation, the manufacturer can be multiple parties, it's still something that needs to be developed in terms of jurisprudence to understand who can be held responsible in this particular aspect. So I think overall that should cover the food nitty-gritties on the 3D printing technology. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to when I can actually order food online. And when I said it's not by a Swiggy or by Zomato, but using 3D printer, where I can get my food printed at home. Let me go now from food, which was more, very interesting, but it's still time where we will see actually things becoming common. To pharmaceutical and life science, where I think this will be used the most, and this will have a very critical impact. We are already seeing things happening in pharma industries using 3D printer. Because the drug can reach places where it otherwise is not very easy to send drugs. Also, it takes care of precision. It takes care of customization. Sometimes we have started looking at organs being printed using 3D printer. So there are very interesting applications which are there, and I would want Shreya to spend few minutes, taking us through the applications and the implications of 3D printing in pharma medical sector.
Thank you so much. So before we just get into how 3D printed drugs or medical devices would be regulated, I'm just going to give like a little bit of background on what the pharma industry in India is like and what are the problems that 3D printing can solve for the pharma industry to encourage the growth of this industry. So the pharma and medical device industry in India is growing at a really rapid pace, and people expect India to be one of the biggest suppliers and exporters of pharmaceutical products and medical device products globally in the next few years. But domestically, with respect to supplies and with respect to manufacture, there are certain issues with the pharmaceutical industry that are hindering its growth and are not letting it grow to its full potential. The first and foremost is the fact that India has a lot of supply chain inefficiencies. What do I mean by that? So supply chain inefficiencies, for instance, for a lot of drugs like vaccines or drugs that require cold storage, it's very difficult to transport these drugs to remote areas. That's one. Second, the way India is placed, there are a lot of remote hilly areas, especially in the north. And so in those areas, it's particularly difficult to make sure that drugs and medical devices are able to reach. Third issue that is that, and this is something that globally is an issue, that manufacturing drugs can be really expensive because you have to have specialized equipment for that drug put in place. So drugs are usually centrally manufactured, and from there they have to be very carefully transported to all different areas of the country, even globally. So for a lot of drugs, manufacturers just have one plant somewhere abroad, and drugs are imported into India, which can increase the price of this drug. So these are all the supply chain inefficiencies that plague the Indian market. And having 3D printing in place can really help us overcome those supply chain inefficiencies. For one, it can help us localize the manufacturing of drugs. So in this way, the pharma industry is a little unique as compared to other industries like FMCG. Because in a drug, the most important component is something called the active pharmaceutical ingredient. That's the actual medicine in your tablet that makes you feel better, that treats you or alleviates your symptoms. So this active pharmaceutical ingredient will still largely be in the control of the manufacturer itself. So to that extent, 3D printing can't decentralize pharma manufacturing a lot, but it can definitely resolve some supply issues. For instance, you can still decentralize manufacturing because now instead of having one central manufacturing plant, you can transport the API, which might be cheaper or easier to transport. And you can have multiple small manufacturing units in different areas of the country. And what's good is that these manufacturing units can manufacture exactly to demand. And so you can ensure that you don't keep, a lot of drugs or more drugs than you need, and there's less wastage and less environmental impact from destroying the expired drugs or destroying drugs that haven't sold or have been returned. So that's one big issue that 3D printing can solve. The other 3D issue that 3D printing can solve is personalized medicine and customized medical devices. Currently, it's very difficult and for doctors to customize dosages beyond what is manufactured. So you have like 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 150 milligrams, and that's what the pharma company makes. If you're somewhere between 50 or 100, well, too bad for you, you have to deal with just one of the doses, right? And so that's an issue that patients have been facing. With respect to medical devices also, some things like joint replacements, knee implants, having medical devices that are customized to your body can really increase the chances of making your treatment outcomes better. So this is another thing that 3D printing can really help us out with respect to the pharma industry. So that's on the impact and the state of the art. And very notably, it's not that 3D printed drugs are something of the future, like VP was mentioning. For instance, in the United States, the US FDA, which is their drug regulator, has already approved one tablet called Spritam, which is 3D printed. And it's very interesting because the way Spritam has been printed, the outer coating is a mesh which you can't make through traditional manufacturing methods. You can only 3D print it. And it's very useful because that drug is for epilepsy patients. So if you're having an epileptic attack, it can be very difficult for you to swallow a drug. But because the Spritam's very special structure, which can only be achieved through 3D printing, all you have to do is put the medicine in your mouth and it dissolves and it acts much quicker than traditional medication can. So it's been very useful for patients. And the FDA has even, approved a lot of customized medical devices which are made for a particular patient. And so you can see that 3D printing really has very useful implications in the pharmaceutical industry. On the point of how these drugs and medical devices will be regulated, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is that under the drugs and cosmetics rules and the medical device rules, which cover pharmaceuticals and medical devices, you need a license at every stage of the supply chain. So you need a license for manufacturing, for importing, and for selling. The only thing you don't need a license for is to be a patient and take the drug. So you have to ensure, as somebody who is 3D printing drugs, if they are having multiple manufacturing facilities, they will need to ensure that they have a drug for each and every facility that is manufacturing the drugs. Even if there are like 50 of them need to get different licenses. And this can be a bit of an obstacle because under the drugs and cosmetics rules, there are very specific quality management requirements that need to be put into place with respect to plant and machinery and the state of the factory. And in case we want smaller units, which are only manufacturing small batches of drugs, it may be difficult for them to put into place these practices. So maybe once 3D printing becomes a little bit more mainstream, we can see the drug regulator maybe providing like easing restrictions or easing requirements on this front. The other thing to keep in mind is that manufacturing at a hospital level, so and this is especially with respect to customized drugs, right? Whenever the drug regulator gives an approval, they give an approval for a particular dosage form. So they'll give an approval for 50, 100, 150. They won't give a drug approval separately for say 89 milligrams, right? So in those instances, it may be a little bit more difficult to customize drugs because obviously pharmaceutical companies can't carry out clinical trials on every single micro dosage possible. And so if we are looking at customized dosage forms for drugs, we would like maybe later on the CDSCO would also have to maybe relax restrictions on this point and allow customized drugs to be manufactured at a hospital level or at a doctor level and under a slightly different regulation, the one that definitely ensures patient safety. So that's a general overview of 3D printing in the pharma industry. Over to you, Deep.
Thank you, Shreya. I think this is very interesting and go on and on. Unfortunately, our time is limited. We just have a few more minutes. I wanted to discuss quite a bit, but we will have to cut short. Jaideep, can you just spend a minute or so talking about product liability on 3D printing?
Sure. So, thanks, Vaibhav. Largely, the issue from a product liability perspective is that the consumer is the manufacturer in a manner of speaking, because it's the end user that prints out the product in many instances. In the case of 3D printing, they have the printer at home. It may not be that common, but in an event where somebody has a printer at home and they printed out the object, they are the manufacturer. Under the current law, the liability for a defective product, that's where the product liability arises, a defect in goods. The liability for that can go to a seller as well as a manufacturer. And it depends who the consumer chooses to sue and who may be at fault for the defect. And the current law doesn't really lay out the delineation of liability down the supply chain. Under the new Consumer Protection Act, which is not yet in force, we estimate that it may take some time to come into force because there's a new regulatory mechanism under it. They have specified the product liability rules in greater detail as to when a manufacturer would be liable, when a seller would be liable, and what are the exceptions. So that's possibly clearer in a 3D printing context. But some interesting questions can arise on fault, and to the extent the consumer itself was at fault with regard to the 3D printing process, they may be out of a remedy. I'll just keep it at that.
Thank you, Jaideep. Really appreciate your thoughts on consumer protection. In fact, there are a lot of things which government also have to do, including coming up with new policies. Think of issues like, we had a situation where one had a CAD file where you can print a gun made of plastic. It had one metal part, but that was something which you could actually replace. So creating, having ability for someone to print weapons at home creates a lot of issues. There was a similar situation where somebody had created assisted suicide machine, which people could 3D print and go and have a suicide, do a suicide. So you have those kind of things also coming up, and there are a lot of things which otherwise government could control, which cannot actually control once this technology becomes more affordable, popular, and pervasive. So government has to think how to regulate a lot of things, and that's something which we will see how things happen in near future. With that, let me just go to question and answer. We will take about possibly one or two questions maximum, and doing it. So let me ask this question to Jaideep. Jaideep, can you spend a minute in question? There's a question in on IP. It says in a country where IP enforcement is lax, digital rights management will be a big concern for CAD file sellers. Currently, there are free online services which enable removal of DRMs in ebooks. Do you foresee a situation changing in India, at least in recent future? Jaideep, you want to take it up?
It's an interesting one, and some of the similar challenges which arise for piracy of online music and books and other content also would arise for CAD files. And I would say it's ultimately a cat and mouse game where the IP holders will try and devise measures to prevent unauthorized reproduction, and the hackers will try and circumvent those measures. And the US has shown, for instance, under the DMCA, as well as our law, for circumventing a technological measure, that certain liability is associated with it. So it will become that cat and mouse game in this context.
Thank you. Also, there is a question which has come in, and maybe I'll address it. Could product liability be attributable to ink providers in 3D printing? The answer is yes. If the raw material or the ink itself was faulty, and if the defect happened due to the faulty ink, then the liability can come there. Also, lot will depend on what kind of disclaimers are used, because if the reaction of that ink in that particular process, which is when it is being printed, is not as per what is expected out of 3D file, there could be a liability attached to the ink, right? So to the ink provider or manufacturer. So yes, the answer is there will be a lot to think about for people who are providing the ink. With this, I think we are running out of time. I would like to close. The only thing I'm again reminding everyone that if you are interested in this subject, we have a paper written on 3D printing on our website. You can go download it. It's very interesting reading. Not just is talking about 3D, but we're also now looking at 4D, where a 4D printing will happen, where actually there is a 3D printing, and on top of it there will be another action which will happen based on time, water, light, heat, etc. But with that, let me go back to Mamta. Over to you. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your participation and being patient listener. Thank you.